This video and all of its contents, including any opinions expressed by the narrator, are strictly for entertainment purposes only and is not intended in any way as a substitute for professional services and consultation from a licensed therapist, doctor, attorney, or other licensed professional service provider. Each person must make their own life decisions, and those decisions are theirs. Welcome back to Find Your Alpha. I'm back at you this week with another terrific video story, and you can see the title right on your screen. Man dumps wife and flees to El Salvador after discovering her affair and getting a paternity test. He's been orange pilled. Now, what does that mean, orange pilled? That means somebody that owns Bitcoin and is a big promoter of Bitcoin. And this guy definitely is. So let's get into this story and see what it's all about. He starts out, he says, I've been married to my wife for 8 months and we have a 19-month-old son. She and I met and started dating casually in 2020. Our relationship began slowly and remained platonic for several months before progressing beyond that point. The lockdown had a lot to do with it, as during that time we were only able to meet up a handful of times. After the restrictions were lifted, our relationship developed quickly and things became intense between us. Then a few months later, she informed me she was pregnant. Are you kidding me? A few months later? That's a red flag, man, a big red flag, and you're going to see why. This came as a complete shock, and I wasn't prepared for it. I used protection nearly every time. However, there were several second rounds when I didn't. Oh, come on, dude. While I mostly blame myself, during those times she encouraged me and told me it was safe based on where she was in her cycle. Never trust a woman to provide the birth control. And if she says she's following the rhythm method like this woman did, don't believe it. I assumed the child to be mine because we had been inseparable since getting serious. You never assume anything when it comes to a pregnancy. Remember that. Though apprehensive at first, I looked forward to being a father. She moved in with me and I attended most of her doctor appointments. When the baby was born, we gave him my first and last name even though we were not married. After living together for just under a year, I proposed and we married a month later. The ceremony was casual and we had a small reception for just our families and a few friends. We were deeply in love and crazy about our son. After taking maternity leave, my wife eventually returned to work. When she did, my mom started watching our son. Since my start time is later, I usually drop him off in the morning and my wife picks him up after work. Oftentimes we end up having supper with my parents as my mom loves to cook. I thought I had the perfect life, but all that changed on Veterans Day. It was a company holiday and we both had the day off. My wife and mother went out shopping while I stayed home with the baby. While putting him down for a nap, I saw her tablet sitting on the dresser and decided to Google something. I'd never used her tablet before, however, she used the same password for everything and I was able to get right in. I didn't give any pause to using her tablet as we openly shared each other's smartphones and our home computer. After completing the search, I decided to check Twitter and Facebook to see what was going on in the world as I waited for my son to fall asleep. Instead of signing into my accounts, I just used hers since she was already logged in. While on Facebook, I decided to check her messages out of curiosity. I wasn't looking for anything. I just wanted to see what she was talking about. So he wanted to do a little snooping. Her recent messages contained nothing notable. All were short messages between her and I, or her with friends, family, and a few coworkers. She's not one to delete messages, so she had thousands of them out there dating all the way back to when she first signed up. I decided to skip back to when we met to see if I could find the first message she sent to me. I was also curious to see what she was telling her friends about me back then. It didn't take long to locate those messages, and it brought back a lot of good memories. I kept on reading and was getting a kick out of what she was saying about me. I then came across an odd conversation between her and another Facebook user whose name I didn't recognize. By reading their messages, I was able to determine the identity of the person. He's a coworker at her company, and not just any coworker. He's a senior manager there, and she works for him and two other managers in an administrative role. It became evident he was using a fake account to communicate with her. While I didn't know him personally, I met and talked to him and his wife multiple times at their company Christmas parties and picnics. His wife even held our son at the last company picnic. You'll find out shortly why this seemingly innocent act was actually a very sinister thing for my wife to let happen. As I read their messages, I quickly realized this man and my wife had been engaged in a physical affair for some time. From what I could tell, it began several months before we met and continued for several months after. The realization of this was beyond painful, and I'll admit I cried like a baby sitting at my son's bedside. As I read farther, I immediately got a knot in my stomach when I came across a set of messages where they discussed her pregnancy. I then saw a message where he asked her whose baby was it. She replied she didn't know for sure. That was like a punch to the gut, and I almost heaved. The thought that my son was not mine was unthinkable. I couldn't believe what I was reading. At that moment, I wanted to scream and punch the wall. In his next message to her, he suggested that since she wasn't sure, she should get an A word to be safe. And you know what the A word is. He told her the company's insurance covers it, and I, meaning the OP, would never have to know. My wife responded stating she couldn't do that. He then followed up in a semi-threatening way, stating it was her decision, but he didn't want any trouble from her down the road if the child turned out to be his. He continued on, stating he wasn't divorcing his wife, and for her not to even think about that. She didn't reply, and that was the last message I could find between them. All of the messages between them were from 2020, with the last being over 2 years ago, just prior to when she told me she was pregnant. It was clear she baby-trapped me with a child that potentially wasn't mine. That's exactly what happened here, and you can see that as plain as day. She was obviously in love with her boss, and she got pregnant, probably, I would guess, on purpose, thinking, hey, I'll get pregnant, and then he'll be obligated to me, and then eventually he will leave his wife and marry me. Well, you can see that guy wasn't going for that. So once she found out that that guy, the guy she really wanted, wasn't going for it, she said, oh, what are my options now? Oh, let me latch on to this nice guy I've been dating. That's what I think happened here. He goes on and he says, I felt like such a fool. I'm not sure why she didn't delete those messages, but I'm sure glad she didn't. Perhaps she planned to use them against him one day? And he says that with a question mark. While watching my son sleep, my feelings went from deep sadness to total anger as I thought about what she had done to us. I thought about confronting her with my mother present as soon as they returned, but decided I probably should get my ducks lined up before doing so. When they did return, I acted as normal as possible, but my mom noticed something was off with me and asked if I was getting sick. I told her no, I was just a little tired chasing Junior around all day. She laughed and said she empathized with me as he wears her out too. The following day I had trouble concentrating at work as I was distracted thinking about what I had to do. The first and most important thing on my list was to get a DNA test, and I scheduled an appointment for later that week. On the day of, I took time off and swung by my parents' house to pick up my son. My mom was surprised to see me. I told her I had to run a few errands for the company and wanted to take my son with me as he loves riding in the car. My mom has a keen bullshit detector, but she bought my story and off we went. During the days that followed, I was a wreck as I waited for the results. The day I got the report back was the worst day of my life, far worse than the day I discovered her affair. I'll never forget the sick feeling I got when I opened the report and saw the negative results. It was like Satan himself had thrust a dagger straight through my chest. The rest of the day was a blur, with my mind going in a million directions. I knew immediately that I couldn't stay married to her after what she had done. However, I wrestled with what to do about my son. I loved him as much as ever, but I have to be honest, after finding out he wasn't mine, I started to view him differently. I didn't treat him differently, but I viewed him differently. I didn't feel comfortable discussing my predicament with anyone, so I had to rely on my inner self. I decided to take time to think things through before making a decision. I continued to act normally, but that was getting more difficult with each passing day. I finally decided the best thing for my son and I would be for me to walk away. I know giving him up will be extremely difficult, but I believe it's the right thing to do. While I love him more than anything, our relationship will never be the same, and after I divorce his mother, it will be too complicated. Here's what I mean by that. Eventually, it's very likely that both my soon-to-be ex and I will find new partners and go on to have more children. When that happens, my son would have three fathers in his life. Think about it. He'd have his sperm donor, his stepfather, and then me, the stupid guy his mother duped into marrying her. Think how complicated that would be for him and for everyone involved. If I stepped away now, he'd forget about me in a few months, and we could avoid all that. So after many sleepless nights, I met with an attorney and got things rolling. He advised me that since we'd been married for less than a year and the marriage was entered into under false pretenses, I could pursue an annulment. So he lucked out here. He explained it would be like the marriage never happened, which sounded great to me. When it came to my son, he told me based on the evidence I provided, he felt a high degree of certainty my case would be successful. However, he looked at me and asked if that's what I really wanted to do. I told him yes, but then I started getting choked up and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. He told me he understood what I was going through and suggested I go home and think it over for one more night before making the final decision. He explained that if the case is successful, my son would be completely out of my life. He said that over the years he's represented a number of men who were in situations like mine, explaining that many of those guys were really messed up by this as they weren't mentally prepared for it. I thanked him and left there feeling emotionally drained. I drove around for a while thinking about everything and then went home and played with my son all evening. When he finally fell asleep on my lap, I took him into his room and put him in bed. I looked at him sleeping so peacefully and I broke down crying. Thankfully, my wife didn't hear me. Later, she did come looking for me and found me laying on top of our bed. I pretended to be asleep and she gently kissed my lips so as not to wake me. While she was kissing me, all I could think of was, "You evil bitch. You're kissing me and going through life like you've done nothing wrong." That night, I don't think I slept more than an hour. I kept thinking of my son and started second guessing my decision, including my decision to divorce. I thought in 20 years, will any of this matter? Will this be something I end up regretting on my deathbed? In the end, I decided to move forward with my original plan. The next morning, I called my attorney and told him I want to move forward with the divorce and the paternity filings. He told me he would get right on it, but said it might take a couple weeks to get everything prepared. In the meantime, he suggested I continue living in the home and acting normally until the paperwork was ready. A few days have since passed and I've made it so far, but I'm really struggling. It's tearing me up knowing I'm going to be walking away from my son. I'm dreading that day, but on the other hand, I can't wait to get this over with. And that's the end of his original post. And now we're going to take a look at some of the comments that he got back. But before we do that, I want to remind you, if you've enjoyed what you've heard so far, make sure you hit that like button. That will help the channel out tremendously. And also be sure to leave a comment. That also will boost this video and help get it seen all over the world. Now, let's take a look at some of those comments. The first one is from a woman. She says, "I feel so sorry for you and your son. What your wife did is cruel, and I don't blame you for divorcing her. But are you prepared to give him up? You've raised him since birth, and you are his father no matter whose blood is coursing through his veins. Under the law, you have as much right to him as she does. I hope you change your mind and decide to stay in his life." The next response is from a guy. He says, "Something similar happened to me when I was 21. I was living with a girl and she got pregnant, so I assumed the child was mine." Here's another guy assuming things. "3 years later, I found out it wasn't, and I walked away from her and the child. At the time, everyone looked at me as some type of villain until she ended up marrying the child's father 2 months later. Stay strong, champ." So there's a perfect example right there of a woman hooking on to a nice guy, This guy was probably paying all her bills and doing everything for her. Meanwhile, she was probably still carrying on with the baby's father. Man, is that disgusting. Next response is from a woman. She says, I know you are going through a lot right now, but I want to tell you things can work out between you and your wife. I did what your wife did and had an affair with a coworker that produced a child. I didn't tell my husband, but he eventually found out 4 years later. Initially, he planned to divorce me, but at the last minute, he decided to give us a chance. She goes on, she says, he told me he was doing it for our biological kids and not for me or my bastard. While those early days were very difficult, eventually he came around and forgave me and took responsibility for our son. That was over 20 years ago, and today we are as happy as we were the day we met. I hope you and your wife work things out. Well, as I always say in these cases, I'd love to actually hear from the husband to get his side of things. I guarantee he doesn't feel the same way about these last 20 years as she does. Let's put it that way. And the final response is from a guy. He says, get out while you can before the courts saddle you with raising another man's child. That happened to me as I live in a communist state that treats men like trash. I wonder what state that is. Could it begin with a C? My wife had an affair and had a baby, but then stuck me with it. I found out about the affair a year later and had a DNA test done which confirmed my worst fears. He goes on, he says, I divorced her and that sailed right through, no problem. But the judge denied my dismissal of paternity, ordering me to pay child support until she's 18. Don't get me wrong, I love that girl like she's my own, but I think it's so unfair for a man to be required to support another man's child. Her bio dad works and should have to pay something. The laws need to change. Amen, brother. I agree with you 100%. Until these laws change, I think you're going to see less and less people getting married because of situations like yours. And this is why it's so important to check the laws in your state before you even think about getting married. If you're in one of these states like he's in that are going to strap the husband no matter what, why do you want to enter into a legal contract that binds you in a situation like that? And now we're going to take a look at his updates. The first one came 3 weeks later. He says, greetings from Playa El Zante, El Salvador. As I sit here watching the sun go down, contemplating my life, I thought I'd take time to provide an update on my situation. About a week after my last post, my attorney finished the paperwork for my divorce and paternity filings. Once they were ready, it was time to put my plan in action. I first sat down and told my parents what was going on. To say they were devastated is an understatement. They were both so upset, especially my mom, as she has been such a big part of my son's life. Both my parents gave me their full support, but my mom asked if there was any way I could see it in my heart to stay in his life. I told her I would love to, Mom, but it was just too complicated. I then explained to her and my dad what I explained in my original post, and they respected my decision. That's great that his parents are supporting him and didn't give him much pushback, even though they gave him a little pushback there, but that could be expected because of the grandchild. But in the end, it looks like they came around and realized that's the best thing for all parties involved. I told them that I'd be moving all my personal belongings to their house and would be staying with them until I found another place. When my wife came home that evening, I'd call her and tell her to meet me at my apartment and confront her there. I told them I'd like them both to be there to make sure things don't get out of hand and to watch the baby. At the confrontation, I was direct and told her I knew all about her affair with her boss. She was stunned, burst into tears, and told me she could explain everything. I told her I would give her plenty of time to speak, but I had more to say. I then handed her the DNA test and told her I'm not her son's father. She started screaming no and buried her face in the couch pillow crying. I let her cry there without saying a word for what seemed like forever. Eventually she sat up and told me she was so sorry and said I was his one and only father and always will be. I told her no, I'm not. She said, please don't say that. I then reached over and handed her a folder containing the paperwork. She asked, what is this? I told her it was a divorce agreement and a petition to disestablish paternity. Hearing this, she threw the folder on the floor and began crying loudly. She kept telling me I wasn't leaving them and to please let her explain. I told her the floor was now hers and I was listening. Instead of talking, she excused herself to the bathroom to get a tissue. She was in there for a good 15 minutes before I went over to check on her. She said she'd be right out, but took another 10 minutes before she did. Now, here's another example of when confronted and being caught flat footed, the woman runs off and locks herself in a room because now she's thinking up, oh man, what am I going to tell him? Now I've got to think of a good excuse. That's what she's doing. When she came out, she wasn't crying. She told me she was deeply sorry and said the affair was the worst mistake of her life. She claimed she ended things right around the time we got serious, but admitted there was some crossover. She said she has been completely faithful to me since that time, including all through our marriage. I told her I believed her, but that doesn't change the fact she cheated and her child wasn't mine. She told me she wasn't 100% sure if I was the father back then, but felt very strongly I was. She then transitioned to saying it didn't matter if I was his biological father or not. Well, of course you're going to say that. She said he loves me more than anyone and I couldn't just leave him. So you can see she's really trying to guilt trip him here. I anticipated she was going to say something like this, and I was prepared. I held my ground and didn't waver, despite her crying and begging me to do so. She was an emotional wreck, and my mother ended up spending the next 3 nights with her and the baby until her mother arrived. I too was emotionally wiped out and needed to get away from everything, so I took PTO and decided to come down here against my parents' wishes. They're worried about me being alone in such a fragile mental state. I've assured them I'm fine and that getting away has helped clear my mind. My soon-to-be ex has been calling and texting me multiple times a day, and it's driving her crazy. I haven't talked to her, but I have responded to a few of her texts. She's been begging me to stay, and I do feel some level of sadness for her, but I've held firm and I don't plan to waver. That's where things stand at this moment. Both of my legal cases have been filed, and I'm just waiting for a court date. I feel a sense of relief, but I miss my son terribly. That pain is still very raw right now, but each day I'm feeling a little better. And that's the end of his first update. And then 2 days later, he comes back with a quick update. He says, this is just a quick follow-up to answer a common question that I've gotten regarding why I'm down here. I came here to get away from everything and because it's the first country to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. I've been orange pilled since 2012 when I bought my first coins for under $10. I sold the majority of those coins in 2017 when the price hit $4,200 and used the proceeds to pay off my student loans, credit card debt, and my parents' mortgage. I also bought 2 new vehicles, plowed a bunch of money into mutual funds, and took a year off from college to live in Europe. So he cashed out and made obviously quite a bit of money. But let me tell you something, the most recent price of Bitcoin was over $42,000. So just think how much he would have had if he would have just held on to it for a few more years. He says, at the time I thought I was a financial genius, but looking back now I feel like a fool as the current price is many times that today. I could have retired a multimillionaire if I would have held them a few more years. Regardless, I've done quite well and I still have some coins, but not quite enough to retire, at least not yet. And that's the end of his second update, and now he comes back with his final update, which occurred 10 months later. He said, I never planned to post here again, but so many of you have been asking for a status update, I thought I'd give you one. The annulment and paternity challenge cases are both complete, and I am free of all my marital obligations. I've started a new job, and I'm splitting my time between the States and El Salvador. When I was down here earlier this year, I fell in love with the place. During that trip, I met the CEO of a blockchain company while sitting at the beach bar one day. We ended up having a lengthy discussion, and the following day he invited me to tour their offices. While there, he had me meet with some of their employees and talk to their HR manager. To give you the TLDR version, they offered me a job the next day. I didn't immediately accept due to my personal situation, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to live in a foreign country. I also still had my job back home that I loved. The CEO told me they'd be willing to let me work remotely from America as long as I spent a couple weeks down there every quarter. He told me to go home and think about it and call him back in a few days. When I got home, I talked to my parents and they supported me. though they were concerned about me working outside the country. They were also concerned that I was just running away from my problems, but I assured them that wasn't the case. In the end, I decided to take the job 5 months ago, and I absolutely love it. I'm back in El Salvador now, and each time I come down here, I like the place more and more. I think I'll eventually make it my primary residence as things stateside are getting too damn crazy. To me, El Salvador gives me vibes of what the United States must have been like after World War II. Everyone here seems so upbeat and looking forward to the future. He says, now getting back to my personal life. Prior to my divorce, my wife tried everything to convince me to change my mind. I do believe she did love me and was sincere, but the damage was done and there was no coming back from it. It's funny, after I started my new job, all the deep hate I had for her seemed to disappear. She noticed, and that upset her more than when I was angry with her. She could tell that I had moved past her. As for her son, that's been the hardest part, but even that has turned out okay. My mom still watches him, and I've stopped over a few times to eat lunch with him when he's been there. Now, he needs to be very careful with this. I mean, I know his mom and his parents really love the child, but the fact that they're still watching him, that maintains that connection with him, and he's got to be very careful about that. He says, when I saw him for the first time in several months, his eyes lit up and he gave me a big kiss and hug. He still remembers me, but I think he sees me now as just a nice guy and not as Dada. He's a great kid and I'll never forget him. I'm amazed at his resiliency and I'm thankful he's adjusted so well. I imagined him crying constantly for me as my wife told me he was, but obviously he is long since past that now. My ex loves when I visit, and she's told my mother she hopes one day we'll get back together, but that's never going to happen. Just be careful, mister. Again, you're keeping that connection with this woman and her child. If you start doing things for the child, she may be able to go after you for child support. So you got to be very careful in these situations. She's still working for the same company, but her asshat lover no longer does. Let's just say a little birdie told his wife all about the workplace romance and love child he had, and she didn't take it too well. Aw, that's too bad, he says with sarcasm. My mom told me he's paying child support to my ex now, but I really don't care as it's none of my business. So I think I've told you everything there is to tell. This will be my last update, and I'll probably end up deleting this post in a few weeks as I don't want anyone figuring out it's me. Thanks for following the roller coaster that has been my life for the past year. Hasta luego, he says. So that's the end of his story, and overall, he made a lot of mistakes up front. We saw that. He didn't use protection. He married the girl and assumed it was his baby right off the bat. All big mistakes. But once he did find out that she cheated and the child wasn't his, he took immediate action, and I think he handled it very well. And now I want to go over what I think are the morals of the story. The first one, use protection every time and never trust a woman to provide it. This woman was telling him, oh, I'm following the rhythm method. Never believe a woman when she tells you that. Next, always DNA test. Never assume anything. Remember that, guys. Never assume anything when it comes to paternity. Next, check the laws in your state and protect your assets before getting into any serious relationship. Now, this guy had Bitcoin and a lot of it, as you heard, and probably had a lot in savings and investments. But apparently he didn't have to split anything or give his wife anything because they annulled the marriage. So he was lucky. He really lucked out. But if he had actually went through a regular divorce, he'd be splitting all his assets with this woman, all his Bitcoin, his investments, and everything else he has. So you always got to protect your assets and check the laws of your state before you get into any relationship. Next, have a passion beyond your relationship that motivates you to live. So many times you hear about these guys, they put all their eggs in their relationship basket. They build their lives 100% around their wives, their girlfriends, or their fiancés, and then if something happens to that relationship, they're just devastated. This guy had a life passion, as you can see, with Bitcoin and with blockchain technology, and that kept him going. That kept his juices flowing, and he was able to get through this very difficult situation pretty easily. And finally, indifference and leading a successful life is the best revenge. So, those are my thoughts, and now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story, and how do you think the guy handled it? Would you have done what he did, or would you have done something completely different? Also, what are your thoughts on Bitcoin? Tell us about it in the comments. Also, be sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to this channel. And I will talk to you